Okay, thanks everybody for attending. And I have notes. And I always like to tell people I have notes because if I don't have notes, I'll just spiral out of control and talk about all kinds of stuff. So I got to try to keep me in line and keep my thoughts together. Also, these programs I tend to run a little long, so I'll understand if you've had enough at any time. You may wander off and check out the rest of the building or the museum. And I know some of you, of course, have maybe have to go to lunch, and then some of you going to the park program maybe later this afternoon. So in this program, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the early black community in Gettysburg and Adams County. And of course, I'm always trying to understand more about the black community during the Civil War and at the time of the battle. And for me, of course, being a licensed battlefield guide and first coming to Gettysburg with an interest to the battle, I sort of look at that as a watershed moment in our county's history. And, so I studied the history up until that point and the history after that point, using that as a benchmark for the other history in the county. And I think the reason it's easier for us to do that is because we know so much about that time in our county's history. So if you play off of that, it works really well. And I can tell you, we'll never understand what it was like to be a slave or even a slave owner during that early period of settlement. Or we may never understand what it's like to be free in the years leading up to the American Civil War and to be constantly fearful or vigilant of slave catchers and kidnappers. But, I think it's worth it for us to try to understand what that must have been like. As historians, what we can do is pull together all the available resources and facts that we can delve from these early records in our county. Of course, one of the problems is that records pertaining to our black community prior to the Civil War are few and far between. In the 1860 census, there were 400 black or mulatto residents in Adams County, and about 200 of them in the borough of Gettysburg. And to me, at the time of the Civil War, there are three different groups of black citizens, or individual, I should say, or groups that we're talking about that make up our community. And there are basically two other groups of white residents that, are very important to the black community. Obviously, some of the residents of Gettysburg were former slaves or children of former slaves that were born in our area, in what is now Adams County, what was then York County, or possibly Lancaster County. And upon gaining freedom, these individuals or groups gravitated to communities such as Gettysburg or enclaves in different parts of the county. And I think many people don't understand this component of our black community. Many people assume that everyone came here from somewhere else and settled here, and they don't understand that there were slaves in the county and that eventually these slaves and their children became free and then continued to live in this area. Why? If you had been a slave in this area, why would you continue to live here? Because your parents live here. Are you going to leave your family, your brothers, your aunts, your uncles? Maybe you're free, but they aren't. So they continue to live here. One can only imagine, and we'll talk about the process of, gaining freedom, the troubling situation if you're free and your parents are slaves, maybe living with different families. In addition to this group, there's a second group of black individuals that were born in nearby Maryland who gained freedom and moved into Pennsylvania, some for increased safety in Free State, Pennsylvania, others because there's better educational opportunities for your children in Pennsylvania as opposed to slave state Maryland. And it was these first two groups of people I just discussed that were the backbone of our black community here in the 1840s and 50s prior to the American Civil War, during the period of the Underground Railroad. And the third group, of course, is those people who were seeking freedom from enslavement in the southern states, and such as Maryland and nearby, Virginia and nearby Maryland. And it was these individuals that required assistance from their fellow brethren that lived here. And their passage from safe house to safe house in Maryland and then through Adams County was perilous and anxious, and could not possibly have been done without assistance. And of course, it was the local black community here that greatly assisted in the movement of these people, whether it was entirely through Adams County in Pennsylvania to points farther north, or if it was once they got into this area to find a safe place to live. And when it comes to the white community, we need to acknowledge those who were lending assistance, secretly or overtly, whether it be abolitionists such as Thaddeus Stevens or members of the Quaker community, or to those who were secretly supplying safe houses as stations on the Underground Railroad. And also, there's a component that you need to understand. People like Thaddeus Stevens, Samuel Simon Schmucker, or David Gilbert, which were in the years prior to the Civil War, in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, were selling property to free black individuals. Can you imagine that component of racism where there's no opportunity for you to buy a home? And there's, in the deed records, we see Thaddeus Stevens, Samuel Schmucker, and David Gilbert assisting black families. And then there were individuals locally and regionally who were profiting from the capture of fugitive slaves, often under protection of the law. The proximity of the Maryland border and the close economic ties to Baltimore and the close ties between the carriage industry and the Shenandoah Valley here led to friction between these different groups. And I want to add another factor into this equation that, not a lot of people think about. Not only were these citizens black, there were often mulattoes or children of mulatto parents. And of course, this means that they were the children or grandchildren of white men. They were descendants of the early settlers of Adams County. And from Maryland, the people most likely to be freed or manumitted by slave owners were their children. And then they came into this area. And you can only imagine the different relationships between black individuals in our area and mulatto individuals in the area who were related to or descendant from maybe and cousins of some of the white citizens lived around them. And there is absolutely no doubt about it. The lighter skinned you were, the better you were treated and the more opportunities for equality you had. And that's often not talked about. Also, when historians tell the story of the battle, they tend to give the impression that our local citizens were detached from the issues that divided our country and the issues that led to the outbreak of war. But not only were the citizens of here, of Adams County, well aware and fully immersed in those issues, they were actually in a position to influence them. So that's kind of where I'm coming from here. Now I wanted to mention that Larry Bowen, who just passed away it was at May or June. He was a volunteer here at the Adams County Historical Society. When I started volunteering here, I have no idea how many years he would have been here, but he wrote a lengthy article in the Adams County History Journal, Volume 9, and we have it for sale downstairs in our bookstore. And he pulled together as many early sources as he could of the slaves that lived in our area. And he noted when he was working on it that it was much easier for him to find the names of the slave holders of Adams County in the tax records in the early sources. So really, it's a book about the slavery in Adams County and who owned slaves. I can tell you that it was always enjoyable talking to him. He was the nicest guy in the world. And on several occasions, genealogists came in and attacked him for suggesting that their families were slaveholders. And, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but, I think when I'm doing genealogy, I'm always thinking, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. My ancestor, was in jail. That's nice. I found in my genealogical research that if your ancestor goes to church every Sunday and lives a good life and never gets in trouble with the law, you're not going to learn anything about them. It's only if they, cross the line that you find good stuff about your ancestors. It doesn't bother me if I find out something about my ancestor that, it's interesting how people react. But, I remember one guy repeatedly came in to try to present evidence to get his family's name out of his journal. So anyway, if you're interested in any of this and you want to spread some gossip in our community, go down and buy the book. And look in, find some names and then go to that person and say, hey, your family owned slaves. No, it's interesting. It's just history, So there were slaves in our county as early as the first settlers. The first settlers brought slaves into the area with them. The will of William McGawkey of Hamilton Bond Township in 1749 mentions a slave. And this is the will of William Dinwiddie or Dunwoody. There's multiple spellings of it. And in his will in 1776, he is giving things to his wife, including their, mulatto Jim and one of the Negro girls that he owned. That's 1776. Okay, there it is. So there are very few records, especially early on, that we can use to learn about the black community, as I said. Did I get? Oh, okay. In 1780, the state of Pennsylvania passed an act in legislature for the gradual abolition of slavery. And, obviously early on, our state is controlled by the Quakers. And early on, it's obvious that the Quakers are pushing an anti-slavery agenda in the state of Pennsylvania. Not at first. William Penn owned slaves. But as time went on, and this kind of gained power in 1780. And I think oftentimes people would say Pennsylvania was the first state to take, an active role in freeing slaves. But Larry Bowen, who read this article, this law thoroughly, in his book, he mentions, its opening passages are indeed noble, but when the text reaches the law itself, only a blurred image of that nobility is reflected. The passage of this act did not free anyone. And it wouldn't be until years later that, slavery would be ended in Pennsylvania, decades later. So although they start this process towards the gradual emancipation of slavery, there's a couple things you should know. If you were a slave at the time of the passage of this act, you were a slave forever, for the rest of your life. Now, if you were a child of a slave mother after the act was passed, you would serve as a slave until you were 28 years old. And then you would gain freedom. So now, of course, as time went by, people were freed, or they were manumitted by their owners, as time went by also. But in reality, according to this law, no one was going to be free until 1808 or later, depending on where you were born to a slave mother. There are relatively few sources that we can use to figure out how many slaves there were in our area at that time. Keep in mind that we're part of York County, Pennsylvania. And when you divide York and Adams County from each other in 1800, there are 6 townships that are along the line of York and Adams that are either divided or, realigned. So when we look at the York County records, it's difficult for us to account for that area we're talking about. But a couple things about it. There is a 1783 tax list from York County that gives the townships and the people who live are taxables in those townships, and it gives the number of slaves that each person owns. And so Larry Bowen did his best to separate the Adams County townships from York County. And it appears that in what is now Adams County in 1783, so 3 years after the passage of this act, there are 161 slave owners with 391 enslaved black residents. It's interesting to me, this is 1783, and there are 391 slaves. And then in 1860, we have like 400 black residents or mulatto residents in the county as a total. So really, the population did not, increase that much from slaves to eventually free. Obviously, new people came in and other people died. William Cochran on that list is listed with 16 slaves. Robert McPherson is listed with 11 slaves. And 12 others have 6 or more slaves. 69 individuals had just 1 slave. If you're wondering, in 1800, when we finally get to census, the total population of Adams County is about 13,000. And we can look at the census records where they actually list the number of slaves that lived in our area in the census record. And we don't know exactly what's going on from 1820 to 1830. Probably the way they were counting people who had time left to serve. In other words, again, if you were born to a slave mother, you had 28 years before you were freed. And so maybe in 1820 census, they decided not to count some of these people that were going to be free soon. So that's why it goes down and goes back up. It's hard to figure it out, because in these census records, especially in the 1800, 1810, 1820, 1830, only the head of the household is given by name. And then there's slash marks for the people free and slave within those households, you probably know. Another thing I wanted to mention, when I start talking about taxable slaves, and we talk about the 1783 York County tax records, not all slaves are taxable. Children are not going to be a valuable part of the household. So it appears, and we don't have an actual date or age, but it appears to be children under 12 are not taxable. And there is one record that suggests that they use the age 55. People that are 55 and older are not taxable. So when you see the taxable slaves, that doesn't include any children that the person owned or elderly mothers and grandmothers with that family that they might have owned. That kind of would make a little bit of a difference, wouldn't it? So we don't know much about them. So again, here's just from, and I think Andrew made this, since Andrew, are we filming it? Okay, Andrew made a mistake. I'm pretty sure there's 111 in 1800, not 114. No big deal. No big deal. But you can see that, and in the 1840 census, for whatever reason, and Larry goes into this in a little more detail in his article, it seems like they just stopped counting. Not to, there's a couple instances where there are slaves mentioned, but they would whatever. Slavery is going to end soon. If you're a slave, whatever. But in the 1850 census, we have one slave listed, and that slave is Patience Hack. And the 1850 census, they actually make a notation over in the right side of the page that says slave. The 1850 census for Pennsylvania, or for the United States, they stopped asking whether there was a slave in the household. You might know in slave states, they had a special schedule, a slave schedule. But on the regular census, they don't even ask if there's a slave or not. But there's one person listed specially, and she died in 1858. And you can see near York Springs. And she was the slave of Leonard Hatter. And it's fascinating that, so until 1858, there was a slave in Adams County that obviously she was born prior to 1780. And then I found this, and Larry, I looked, and Larry did know about this, although we had not talked about this. This was more of, I'm just doing this for my research. There was a slave named Het, or Hetty. She was a former slave of Peter Ickes. Is that how you pronounce it? I don't know, from Abbottstown. She died in 1866, and are mentioned of her in the Eisenhardt papers we have here. Also, she's buried at St. John's Lutheran Church Cemetery in Abbottstown, but I haven't been through that cemetery looking for her stone. I am unaware that she has a stone, but somebody can go out and find it if they want. Her date of birth is given as November 16th, 1779, a few months before the gradual abolition of slavery. And you can see in the Gettysburg newspaper, they even mention a relic of Pennsylvania slavery, which I find is interesting. In the 1850 census, she's listed in the household of Joseph Henry, druggist of Abbottstown. And she's listed as Het, black, 70 years old. No place of birth is given, and no last name. In the 1840 census, I also found that the household of Joseph Henry in Abbottstown, they were next door to Colonel George Ickes. And a free colored woman is mentioned in that household between 34 and 50 that matches her perfectly. So I find that interesting there. So possibly, the last slave in Adams County died. Now, she was a slave. She obviously, looking at these records, had at some point been freed. Unlike Patience Hack, who we have no evidence was ever given her freedom. So what kind of early records do we have? Here's a newspaper article. You can see that it was reprinted in the Sentinel here, but it was from the compiler of May 26, 1876, where someone had found some records of the names of the black inhabitants of Cumberland Township and Gettysburg that are listed on something, an assessment, and you can see they give their first names and their age. And it's just fascinating. This kind of stuff is fascinating to me. Now, taking names of slaves in these early records and trying to attach them to later people that live here in Gettysburg and Adams County is very, very difficult. So there's a few examples, but most of the slaves don't have last names. And the common names, first names, are used over and over again in the records. And sometimes, though, we have exact dates of birth or ages. So what I can tell you is in 1850, we have a census record, and for the first time, black residents or mulatto residents are given with their full names and ages. And so that's our first opportunity to connect some of these early slaves with the people that lived here in the 1850s and up through the time of the Civil War. So, I've kind of taken the 1850 census, 1860 census, 1870 census, taken as much information I can from these early records and tried to connect them. And I have made some connections. Larry made some connections. And I think it's worth a try and it's worth understanding. Again, I think a lot of people have assumed over the years that the slaves, as soon as they became free, they left and didn't live here anymore. And that the people that live here at the time of the Civil War are coming in from other places. And that's not the case. A lot of the people that were slaves here just remained in this area and formed the backbone of our black communities all across the county and in Gettysburg. Okay. Did you notice in that record on the right how it gives the slave owners in Gettysburg? And you can see who the slave owners are. Oh, should I mention this? A couple things. The Scotch-Irish are more likely to be slave owners than any other group in our area. And then number two is the Dutch, the Low Dutch. Not the Germans, but the Low Dutch. And then one more thing before I take. The people with occupations or most likely own slaves are farmers. And then number two would be millers. And I think number three is tavern keepers. All the taverns have slaves working at the taverns.
Do you think that there's any significance in here at the bottom on 1802 that you have the slaves described as Negro, except for under James Scott, where it's described as a man and a woman, like perhaps they were not Negro in another ethnic background?
Like mulatto, or you mean maybe? See, now, obviously we have this issue in Pennsylvania when you're looking at your early records that there are, people who are bound out or servants, indentured servants. And I can tell you that a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot of people, there are some people that always come into this conversation like, well, you're counting indentured servants as slaves. Anybody ever be on Facebook and someone posts, there were more Irish slaves in the United States than black slaves? This is just overt racism. And it is hard for us, especially in advertisements and runaway advertisements, to tell the difference between an indentured servant and a servant. Because, again, a child that has to serve until they're 28 years old, sometimes they call them servants. So there is some problems with our understanding of the lexicon or that's being used. So I can't answer your question. How about that after all that? But I do want to mention that, Larry was conscious of this when he was doing it, because occasionally you'll find an advertisement in the newspaper where, someone's run away, and a runaway doesn't always necessarily have to be a slave. And unless it spells out that he's black and gives a description, or that he has so many years left to serve. That's another tricky thing. When people see that he has 6 years left to serve, they think, oh, he's an indentured servant. No, that's usually a reference to how old they are, and they're not 28 years of age yet. But it is interesting. So let me show you some other interesting sources that we have found over the years. There is a miscellaneous file in the Adams County records, and it says slaves on this file. And in there are some early lists, and this is apparently 1800 or 1801, and it is a list of the male and female slaves and their ages that lived that were taxable in Hamilton, Bond, and Liberty Townships. And again, if you look at their ages, do you see there's no one doll I see as, I think she might be 55 there, but there's no young people and there's no older people on that list. And I find it interesting to look at the names. I see over on the right-hand side, there's a female called Mint. And there's 2 women in Gettysburg named Minty in the 1850 census. And so, you suspect that somebody may be Minty. Maybe that's not such a common name. But again, I can't find that person's place of birth or, more specifically than just Pennsylvania. But Dinah, people always talk about Dinah, Dinah who was worked for Thaddeus Stevens. It was murdered, remember, in the early records. But there's so many people named Dinah. But there you go. It seemed like Hamilton Bond Township, maybe just because it's loaded with Scotch-Irish early on in our history, is one of the places where the most slaves are held as one of the townships. Here is a list. Again, it's not dated, but we think it's probably from 1800, 1801, because it was in that file with the other lists. And it gives a enumeration of the slaves in Mountjoy Township. And you can see their names and their ages. So we know they were trying to keep track. The townships were trying to keep track of taxable slaves. And we do have mentions of slaves as taxables in the tax records themselves. But here is, I don't know, Andrew Shriver, it's probably Germany Township. George Kitzmiller's Mill, and Shriver, that's probably Germany Township. But here they don't give the names, they just give some tabulations for the slaves. And here's another Germany Township list. See James McSherry. Let's see. Just wanted to show you some examples of stuff we have. This is interesting. Names of persons, owners of slaves in Mount Pleasant Township, Adams County, and it says in the year 1800. See at the bottom, Peter Wolford. So Peter Wolford dies, and we have his estate papers, and his wife gets his property, and then his wife dies, and she dies in 1826, And this is her will. And she says, to my colored slave Plem, I give and bequeath at my decease, his freedom from slavery, also the sum of $100. Now, there's a little complication here. And this complication at first might seem unnecessary, but it really, really helps us historians. Okay. To remain in the hands of my son, John Wolford, to be given to him, Plem, as I don't even know what that is. But basically, to support him when he becomes old or infirm. So we gave him $100, but my son's going to hold it until, whatever. So in 1854, what's that? 20 years later, 25 years later, Plem gets a lawyer because the money's never been given to him. And in the document, it says, personally appeared before us, Benjamin Craig, formerly called Plem. So here is one of the few examples where we have a person that we can identify and document through the later records, and we know his slave name and his slave owner in the early records, all the way back to 1800. And again, I think my main suggestion here is not that we can always do this, but this is a thing that the people that live here, a lot of them, are not from other places, that they're from slavery right here. And that's my main point, I guess. Benjamin Craig is a fascinating individual. So he's born about 1792. In the 1850 census, he clearly lives in this house. This house was on Steinway Avenue. It was torn down like 1910, and it is where the Avenue Restaurant would be, or May's Noodle House. I hate when I have to change my new references. But this is a little log cabin that could possibly have been the house lived in by John Carson before Alexander Dobbin bought it and built the Dobbin house. So it's on Alexander Dobbin's land. But he lives here in 1850. And born in 1792. And after he was freed, he married a widow named Mary Wagner, who had a child. She was white. And I think he's listed in mulatto in some records. And they lived here in 1850. At the time of the Civil War, starting in 1860, they live on the Taneytown Road. And they live across from the National Park maintenance building on the Taneytown Road. And probably they sold the property by 1863 because a guy named Isaac Shriver lived there at the time of the battle. But in the 1860 census, they're living on the Taneytown Road. And that's right. That's not far at all from your house. That's right. I hadn't even thought about that. So he's mentioned in the estate papers of Barbara Wolford. The children of this marriage in the census record are listed as mulatto. So in several records, in the 50 census and 60 census, the 50 census, they call him Benjamin Plem. In the 60 census, they call him Benjamin Craig. But he is listed as black, his wife is listed as white, and their children are mulatto. And 2 of his sons served in the United States colored troops during the Civil War. So just fascinating. He died in 1869. But I highlighted him because he's someone you don't necessarily hear about. I mentioned that if your parents are mulatto, or you have more white mixed in with you, then you're treated better, and there's more opportunity for equality. Let's put it that way. Here is something I discovered in York Springs, Pennsylvania. There's this guy, James Madison Galvin, or Galvin. Isn't that a great name, James Madison? He is mulatto. He marries a white female in York Springs, and in the 1870 census, do you see how his children are listed? You know what that means? Quadroon. I had never seen this before in our local census. Quadroons. So they're a quarter black. So, it's just fascinating to me that they're using that designation. Now, John, in the 1870 census, who is 23, he served in the American Civil War in Company I, the 127th Infantry. He was in a white unit, was at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So obviously, he passed as being white. And clearly, when you look at some of the daughters in the later census record are shown as being white. 2 of them moved to St. Louis. So, again, I just think it's worth noting that if you're mulatto, and we don't know, I don't know who James Madison Galvin's father is, but it could be someone with influence in the community who would actually help his son in some form or fashion. Okay. So this is interesting too. Here is Reading Township. Oh, I wanted to mention this. I guess I got these 2 slides out of order, I think. But here is, so there was this, let me start again. This process is kind of complicated. So in 1780, they decided that if you were born after the passage of that act, then when you turned 28 years old, you were free. Are we going to trust the slave owner to keep track of the age of children and, maybe uneducated young men or women about how old they are so that when they become 28, we can make sure they're freed? We had this issue with indentured servants from the almshouse also. Like a kid at the almshouse, parents died, and he's taken in by someone until he becomes like 17 or 18, and they just keep lying to the kid about their age. So, you know what the state did? They required that slave children be registered. And we know that while we were York County from 1780 to 1800, if you owned a slave and she gave birth to a child, you had to register that slave with the authorities at the York County Courthouse. We today have no records whatsoever that we can find, and several people have looked in York County, that what happened to these records of the births of children born to slave mothers. But we know they existed, because here's one from Reading Township where 2 individuals, and this comes to us this was saved by the Chamberlain family and handed down through their family, and we have it in the Chamberlain family papers. But you see how they're giving the names of the slaves that they owned that were born after 1780 and the dates of their birth, putting on there. And it was probably something that they had to hand in, these 2 Chamberlains. Isn't that wild? Okay. So I forget why. I think this is out of order, but I'll talk about it anyway. Oh, no. I understand why I put it here. Okay. I get a lot on my mind, I guess. Okay. And I've started a database. It's 250 pages now, but it's the black residents of Adams County from the beginning of our county to just past the Civil War. And I couldn't tell you how many people I have on the list. But then, over the years, I tried to research some of these families and people, and I found this guy. This photograph, or the illustration of him, is from a book called, let's see, what's it called here? The Morgan History of the New Jersey Conference of the AME Church. It's an 1887 book from Camden, New Jersey. And according to this history, under this photograph, it says, Walter Thompson was born January 21st, 1844 in Adams County near Gettysburg. His father and mother both served out their time in private families until they were 28 years of age. Great stuff. The father in the family by the name of Cobean, of Scotch descent, and the mother in the family of a name of McKesson. Okay, both these families are from Hamilton Bond Township. Yeah. That's it. We have the names of the families. And and of course I can go now to the slave tax records and then try to guess, it's kind of hard which person or / their parents might be. He attended county schools 3 months a year for 6 years and came to the AME Church in 1860 in Gettysburg. And he was licensed, let's see. I actually found him mentioned in the AME Church records, and he was licensed by Reverend Abraham Cole in Gettysburg. So he's listed in their records on December 21st, 1861, as giving a sermon, I think. Let's see. I found him, I don't list it here, but I found his parents in the census in Hamilton Bond Township in the 1850 census, and he was living with them. So, there's an opportunity for us to find some of these people and the stories of their family. But again, it's kind of few and far between. Now, here's something really interesting. And we have this on display downstairs in our museum. We encourage you to go down and look at it. We have, from the Adams County Courthouse, and I'm not sure who first discovered it there, maybe Dr. Gladfelter, but Larry Bowen made good use of it. When we were designing our museum, I remembered that Larry told me the original was in the courthouse, and I went to the Prothonotari's office. We had a meeting with them, and they lent it to us for our museum. Starting in 1800, the Adams County Courthouse had a book so that slave owners could register the children born of slave parents into it, and it goes from 1800 to 1820, I think 1820. And so it has the name of the slave owner, occupation, where they resided, the township, the name of the child, and then you can see when they were born, an exact date of birth, and the registered date that they register them at the courthouse. Just a fabulous resource. I think there's over 100 names of slave children in the book. I was hoping at one time, when I got to a record, I was hoping, okay, so I have their dates of birth. Can I go to Lincoln Cemetery, look at the dates of birth on the stones and match dates of birth up? I have not been able to. Because, a lot of especially with the early people, their stones don't really tell you the dates of birth. But it's a clue to who people are, and it gives a first name. Do you see some of them are mulatto? So, like with the case of Samuel in Berwick Township and James Horman, is he the dad? I don't know how you determine, it's not like that we have records to determine that, but some white male is the dad. William Horner, farmer, Mountjoy Township. There's a kid named Abraham. He's born in April 1808. Okay, you got that? Look at this. This is from our local newspaper 2 years later. He's selling the time of a likely Negro wench who has 6 years to serve. Okay, so that means that she's 22 years old and she has 6 more years to serve. Okay? And has a child about 2 years old. Abraham, born in 1808. And again, look, it's May 22nd. That was April 1808. They will be sold together or separate. So, here's my point. This is not like Louisiana. This is like Adams County. And I'm pretty sure from everything I've read that that's illegal. There's a specific, in the 1780 rule, specific thing, you can't separate children from their parents. And I think after the child was 4 years old, it became more sketchy. But you can't do that. And besides that, she's not a slave, she's a servant. So let me set this. Okay, we don't know what happened. We don't know, we'll never know the whole story. But let's say he sold them separate. And then in 6 years, she's free. Does she get to go and find her child? And is he free? Or the children born to servants, slaves, until they're 28? Are they free? Whoa. You can see that there's a lot of legal wrangling that probably took place. I saw some of this in like Maryland courts in Tennessee where there's still slavery exists, this very complicated process. And I think people that have researched it, like Larry, he reiterated a few times that perhaps the Pennsylvania state legislature should have at some point just done away with slavery, like in 1820 or 1830 or 1840, instead of letting this weird process play out with all these loose ends involved in it. Wow. But anyway, I don't know how to, that's just pretty harsh.
Wasn't that 1846?
Did they, that's correct, that's true. Yeah, there is something like that. But Patience Hacked is a slave until 1858.
Well, my mother was a slave in 1963. That's a footnote. I'll just let you know that. We can talk about that.
Okay. So, so there is some ifs, ands, or buts. Here's an interesting thing that we have in our collection. And we do have some, like I said, some documents that pertain to early slaves. But here's the sale of a slave and 1790. So you can see, and this is Patrick McSherry, of course, McSherry's town. And he's selling a slave to Thomas, I thought it was Lorimore. And you can see the language there. And I think that's kind of interesting. So we have that on display in the museum in our collection. And, the newspapers are great for notices of runaways. Now, again, some of these runaways are indentured servants or people who are bound out to people. You know how, apprentice would take on an apprenticeship with someone for a few years before they went into the career. But clearly, some of these notices do pertain to slaves. Look at this. A Negro man by the name of Charles with an iron collar about his neck. Next says he's a slave in the property of William Campbell near Lexington, Kentucky. And he ran away August last. Oh, so for 6 months he's had a collar on his neck? And so the sheriff has picked him up and is holding him to see if the master will come and get him, and puts a notice in the newspaper that might be picked up by other newspapers. And that was kind of common in our early on. If somebody was suspected of being a runaway or a slave, they would pick them up and hold them at the jail and put a notice in the paper. And you can see that they're not going to hold him indefinitely. his master is desired to come and take him away, otherwise he'll be discharged. So they hold them for a while to see if somebody comes to claim them. And again, you can see this over and over again in our local paper, A Runaway from Baltimore. That is why, obviously, the people who are fleeing bondage need to be assisted through this area by other people. And then here is just another sales notice in our paper. It's interesting, a lot of times I found that, the paper will advertise a sale of someone, and, they have years left to serve, but they won't put the name of the person in the paper or anything like that. Just come to the paper office, we'll give you the details if you want to hire someone or if you want to buy someone. So, a couple things, and I think it's important to note that the black community here themselves took an active role in helping other people to gain freedom, whether it be trying to suggest to people that people fight things in court or change existing laws or help fugitives that are coming through the area. And there is a slave refuge society formed in Gettysburg in 1840 at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the names that are given on here are local Gettysburg residents. And you can see that there's a notice in a Philadelphia newspaper. Now, this notice is in a Philadelphia newspaper it's called the Pennsylvania Freeman. So it's a black newspaper that was printed, I think, between 1835, 1837, and 1842. And it has this notice in it. And in our museum, I thought I had something else coming up, but in our museum, we highlight the efforts of white residents to assist in the Underground Railroad or assist in helping people that are fleeing, gain freedom. And we have a display on the Wright family, William and Phoebe Wright of York Springs. And of course, we highlight the McAllister family at McAllister Mill just south of Gettysburg that are well known to be involved in these activities. I should mention that HGAC gives walking tours of the McAllister Mill site every Saturday at 11 a.m. from May until August. Every Saturday, 11 a.m., May to August. And it is an awesome site. We actually took a tour for some of the members of the society there last year. And the mill no longer stands, but the foundation of it's still there. You can see where it was. You can learn all about that on their tours. And I mentioned earlier, there were other people like Thaddeus Stevens who, really helped the people in this area. And he was a proponent of greater equality. And so it was really tough for, after slaves were emancipated or, received freedom, manumitted, to find opportunities to support their families, for work, for renting homes, for buying homes. Now, there is a document that is just incredible. And this document you can find at the state archives. And it's an 1847 anti-slavery petition from Gettysburg with 110 signatures on it. And, I have these people on my lists, and absolutely, they are residents of Gettysburg and the surrounding area, Cumberland Township. And some of these people are well-known individuals in our community. Abraham Bryan, the Butlers. Aaron Constant actually kept the list. I'll show where he lived in a minute. Henry Butler, Upton Johnson. You can see over here that probably Ephraim Hopkins, maybe that's Edward Hopkins, I'm not sure. Harriet Palm, we think we know where she lives. Emily Cole. So there's, like I said, I see 110 names on it, and it's just a fascinating document. Okay, let's see. And of course, in our museum, we highlight the fact that slave catchers were coming into the area, and of course, Kitty Payne was kidnapped in 1845, and there was an attempt to kidnap Mag Palm in 1858 from Gettysburg, and these are well-established accounts in the newspaper. And it's interesting to me that there are just overt references by members of the black community to assist runaway slaves and to do whatever they can to help people that are trying to free bondage and at the risk of their own safety. Andrew put a couple things in here for me. He wanted to show the black population in Adams County, slave or free, in the census records over the years. And you can see the height of our population up and over 600 is probably from 1840. Now, some of that probably has to do with the fact that once you gain your freedom, and if you don't have local ties, do you want to hang around near the border with Maryland where it's not as safe? Then you might migrate to Harrisburg or some other city. You can go to York, Chambersburg. Still, you might have the same problems, there. But this is the 1850 census. How many black or mulatto individuals appear in the 1850 census? And you can see that most of the black community is living in Gettysburg. 201 in 1850 and 73 in Cumberland Township around Gettysburg for the most part. And, 70 are shown in Hamilton Bond Township. There was a great demand, of course, at the furnaces, like Mariah Furnace. And then I was going to say that, in Manawan Township, of course, the Quaker presence up there, there's no doubt that they were helping black families, and they were more prone to assist them. And, the iron furnaces at Pine Grove and, of course, Caledonia Furnace are going to be employers for the black community. And I wanted to mention with Thaddeus Stevens, let's see where did I put that? I think I did put that in here somewhere. Okay. So even when we're talking about nearby Franklin County, let me go back one first of all. Besides the large population, there's enclaves of black citizens in other areas. But you can see it's not like there's a lot of black families living in Littlestown or East Berlin. But I was going to mention nearby. I did mention that. Let me go to this now. So, Greene Township, Franklin County, where Thaddeus Stevens Furnace is, in the 1860 census lists 111 black or mulatto citizens, men, women, and children. They are scattered all around the township, but it appears that many lived in a village known as Africa, or Little Africa. And this is a few miles west of Caledonia. Do you remember that, I don't even know what it's called now. It was a little pizza shop. It was called Poorman's Pizza. No? Just after you go by Caledonia, it was on the left-hand side. I know I'm being obscure. But up in the woods up there, it's more modern houses, but I've been up there. It appears on some of these maps. There was a little community for the workers of Caledonia Furnace. And although in the census, most of them are listed as laborers, James Luckett gave his opportunity as collier, and David Lyles is keeper at the furnace. Everyone is born in Maryland or Pennsylvania in the census. Perhaps that's not true. I wonder when I showed you the 1850 census, Are black individuals going to volunteer to be in the census, or do you think they might hide from the census taker? Are they going to tell them they're from Kentucky or North Carolina or South Carolina? To me, there's a natural inclination that these people would not say exactly where they're from. So everyone is from Maryland or Pennsylvania except one person, a 70-year-old guy named William Brown, who works at the furnace. He claims he was from Batavia. Do you know where that is? That is the Dutch name for Jakarta, Indonesia. So there's a slave that someone, and that's like the capital of the slave trade by the Dutch, in the South Pacific. And he's working at the furnace at Caledonia in 1850. Or I'm sorry, 1860. This is the 1860 census. That blows my mind. Okay. And after 1860, the population, with the outbreak of the war, the demand for iron, and of course with the people fleeing from the South, from slavery, probably Caledonia just became more and more of a spot where former slaves congregated. And Thaddeus Stevens is in charge of it. So he's going to protect that community. The same thing goes for Pine Grove Furnace. I think it was Troy Harmon at the National Military Park at, I think it might have been his master's paper, but he did a paper on Pine Grove Furnace's black community, if you get a chance to see that. And, Deb McCausland, and I thought she might be here today, she did a paper on Yellow Hill, a black community in Butler Township prior to and after the Civil War. And of course, they existed with a large amount of help from the Quaker community. But as we said, most of the community lived in and around Gettysburg and Cumberland Township, and I want to show you a few things that I collected about that. And Andrew, he threw in some things he wanted me to make sure to tell you. So here's the 1850 census in Gettysburg. So the black population in 1850 makes up almost 10% of the borough population. And the birthplace of most of these people, 65%, is given as Pennsylvania. Again, I'm thinking they were in families that were former slave families, and after they gained freedom, they congregated to the Gettysburg area. And again, 25% from nearby Maryland, and a smaller percentage that definitely came here from other Virginia, other slave states. And, at first, most of the black community live together in certain sections of the town. Like, there aren't black residents living in the square or in the main streets off of the square. So to give you an idea, there's some people that live out near the Lutheran Seminary. There's some people that live on West High Street and West Middle Street, and there's some people that live along Long Lane in what is actually Dr. David Gilbert's Additions. And there's people that live farther along Long Lane, and on South Washington Street, Thomas Cooper's Additions. And Thomas Cooper got his land from, what was once Alexander Dobbins' property, or from Thomas C. Miller, who bought Dobbins' property. So there are certain people in our community that are more likely to sell land to black citizens. And here we had this extraordinary photograph from 1863 from Seminary Ridge. It looks down the old Millerstown Road, and on the right there's Middle Street. Of course, the Millerstown Road no longer exists, and in the foreground, none of these houses exist. But here is the home, a couple homes owned by black families. The Abraham Cole house, Reverend Abraham Cole, who presided over the AME Church at the time of the Civil War. We mentioned him earlier. and the house of Maria Palm, who is probably the mother of Alf Palm, the husband of Mag Palm, who was kidnapped in 1858. Some of these relationships we presume from the census records. Of course, it is difficult for members of the black community to marry. And when I've searched for marriages in local churches, the Methodist Church marries black citizens. The Conewaga Chapel in, over near McSherrystown, the Conewaga, Catholic Church, they have marriages of black citizens. The Gettysburg Catholic Church, in their records, have marriages of black citizens, and of course in the AME Church. But we don't have the marriage records for the early AME Church. So, and again, at that time, there's no marriage licenses or marriages, you didn't have to get a license outside of the church at that time. So these individuals had purchased their property from Samuel Simon Schmucker, who of course is just up here on top of the hill at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and built houses along the western edge of the town. And this is where that would be today, in case you're wondering, the two houses. Yeah, they no longer stand, but they would be both right there. Okay? So it's very close. And there, you might know those buildings are dormitories for the seminary. And do you know there's a newspaper account of Maria Harris, or Maria Palm, fleeing the area with her grandchildren at the time of the battle. And this is something that Andrew had in his show, and I just put it in here, but we know a little bit about her and who her grandchildren were. So you don't have to read that if you don't want, but you can read the thing I have highlighted. So we do have some accounts of the people who lived here at the time of the battle and what they went through. And again, that was up there. Another place where there are houses that we know that black families lived in at the time of the battle would be on West Middle Street. And you see the little area I have circled. And we can look on this particular photograph. That photograph from Seminary Ridge, the one I just showed, this is sort of an accompanying image of it. It's kind of a two-plate panorama. You see those houses there on West Middle Street, at the corner of West Middle Street and West Street today, which was just an alley. There are three houses. And then we have John Disnick, who grew up in Gettysburg. He and his wife, Margaret, had two sons, John and George. John, the son, actually served in the United States Colored Troops, and he died in 1865. His mother then remarried Nelson Royer, another USCT. Their picture was taken outside of their small house. Oh, I see Andrew has here written in notes. Tim Smith discovered it many years ago in the Park Library. So I was at the Gettysburg National Military Park, and Gary and I were collecting photographs for the new museum that was being put in 2008. And we were going through the photographs they had, and I found this photograph given to them by a local family, and on the back it said South Washington Street. And it gave the guy's name as Nelson Poyer. And right away I knew it was Nelson Royer, a USCT, and that was Margaret Disnick. And it was on West Middle Street. I wonder if I have another image of it come up. Maybe not. So we have a photograph of that first house, the Aaron Constant house. And he's also a reverend, but associated with the, the Asbury Methodist Church later, and not the AME. There were kind of two, at that time, congregations in the town of Gettysburg for the black community. But Aaron Constant lived in the next house, which these two houses, they no longer stand. And then in the third one is the Brooks Herb house. So there's these three houses that maybe in that photograph you don't notice they sit by themselves. But here, if you look at Matthew Brady's photograph from Seminary Ridge, you can see those 3 houses sitting out by themselves. You see that? Or in that case, 4 houses. No, it's 3. There's just a gap between them. And here's the one on the end. That's my best image of the thing I got from the park. And it was given to the park by a local black family. And no doubt that's the same house there on the edge. You can maybe see on the right, if you look down, when this photograph was taken, probably, after 1900, do you see those houses down on the right? They're across West Street from like the direct-to-you gas station. You ever get your gas there? And you can see those houses. But anyway, today, that's what this corner looks like. Right there. And Aaron Constant, who lived in the next house, Mary Warren Foshnot mentions the colored minister's widow and daughter living not far from their home. I think Aaron Constant had died, and his widow and, at the time of the battle, his daughter live across the street, and they actually are hidden out by Mary Warren. Mary Warren, her house was where Kenny's Market is now today. So I think that's fascinating. I like that they say the daughter's husband was in the Union Army. I don't know who that could have been. They're obviously talking about the USCT. Now, Mary Warren wrote that later, so it could be a later USCT regiment. Now, also, that's where I was just talking about. Now, what happened there? I went back a little bit. There it is. Okay, so there's another group of houses on West High Street, and I wanted to show you that in this photograph, and you can kind of see them over here. See the houses out there. And we actually have an article that talks about one of those houses being torn down. The old Keziah Cuff house was torn down. And you know what? We didn't put the date of this article, so I don't remember off the top of my head. Okay, but there were 2 houses that the Cuff family is associated with, and you can see these little houses. So the farthest house in this view of the little cluster of houses is where a Beer Mart is. Or no, I'm sorry. Wow, why did I call it that? High Street Brews. Okay, I go to High Street Brews all the time, but I think I prefer Beer Mart. High Street Brews. It used to be called Little Deb's. Okay, good. Let's see what's going on there. There you go. There's a little cluster. Whoop, what happened there? 1926. I have no. Oh, okay. Andrew did this. I'm not this creative. So Keziah Cuff lived an interesting life. She's born to Frank Thomas and Sarah Anthony, both of Maryland. This cluster of houses is Marylanders who gained freedom and came into Gettysburg prior to the Civil War. Keziah lived on High Street in Gettysburg for over 80 years. As a teenager, she signed that anti-slavery petition in 1847. She says to be born in Cumberland Township. Her parents probably came to Pennsylvania shortly before she was born. Let's go on. When she died in 1926, she is said to be 122 years old. And of course, I think it's interesting whenever somebody lives to be long time, they always attribute their long life to tobacco. Is this like a conspiracy by the tobacco people? I see it all the time. And it's not just said just once. So she's not 122. All you had to do was look at the census records. But here's her death certificate. And there's a picture of her that we got. We got 2 pictures of her. One comes to us by a local family through the Gettysburg Black History Museum, And another one comes to us through Elsie Singmaster, who knew her and wrote about her and used her as a character in some of her fictional works. So it's fascinating. And she's the wife of William Cuff, you can see. Cuff sometimes spelled with a K, sometimes spelled with a C. And then here's the one that we have in our collection from Elsie Singmaster. And she's standing in front of two of those houses. In this one of the houses on the end near the, beer store. And then the other one I just showed was the next house. So they had two houses that they owned there. So according to our best research, she's 91. She is old. She's just not 122. And we know this by comparing the ages that she gives in the various records, including the census record, and then all of a sudden she's 122, But I found this, a friend of mine put this photograph up on his Gettysburg vintage photograph site, and he didn't know anything about it. He just got it in a private collection, and I think it's around 1913. It comes with a collection of someone who's coming here for the 50th anniversary. Well, they went to this house, and you can see a relic of old Gettysburg, a log house, which must have been old during the battle. And I saw it on the site, and I was like, wow, that's Keziah Cuff's house. I remember, I forget who I might have showed it to, maybe Mary first, and she was like, how do you know that? Yeah. Look at that. I do it right away. Right away. And then look how there's a little jut out falling down, like a little back of the house. Do you see that? And here's on the Sanborn fire insurance map. So you can see that corner. That's right at the High Street Brews where that stood. Okay. And then a couple more things. This is where we're talking about those houses are on West High Street. Then we had, won't talk much about him, but we have, families that lived along Long Lane. Oh, one thing I do want to mention, because I didn't realize that this was such a problem for people to grasp until one day somebody mentioned it to me. Long Lane comes into the town. Today, there's a stop sign there. And you turn and you go to Breckenridge Street. Breckenridge Street did not go all the way through. You hit that and Long Lane still goes all the way to High Street. You see that? And today, you get to this point and West Street, which is Franklin Street today, is that confusing you? Comes out across here. You see that? Long Lane just continued all the way up. So none of these houses stand because they totally rerouted all the streets in that area. Okay. Well, I know Breckenridge Street came over in the 1870s, 1880s. And by 1900, they did away with Long Lane. So Owen Robinson lives in a house where Long Lane hits West High Street. And he was a well-known figure in the town. And again, I think he came from Maryland. And he had been, I made a mistake there. He had been a former slave. And he carried around in his pocket his manumission papers because he was afraid that somebody would question the legality of his freedom. According to Charles McCurdy, who wrote an account of the battle, he had an oyster saloon on Chambersburg Street near the square. And he also sold oysters and ice cream. And everybody knows how oysters and ice cream go together really well, right? Do you know what they both have in common? Ice. I hope he wasn't using the leftover ice from transporting the oysters for his ice cream, but I fear that's what he was doing. Probably tastes good, right? But he, according to Charles McCurdy, fled the area during the Civil War. We have advertisements for his oyster saloon, an ice cream shop. There you go. Chambersburg Street, opposite Bueller's drugstore. So we kind of know exactly where it was. But let's see. Of course, when he died, he was said to be 110. Clearly, he's not 110. Again, it's an example. You know what this is really an example of? That early on, especially in Maryland, people came from Maryland, they're not keeping track of how old people are. There's not like, it's not like even you don't know your birth date real well. There's not like official records of when people are born. Maybe the people up here are fortunate because of the slave registry that their dates of birth are known, at least to them, but not from people from Maryland. So when he died, it was said he was 110. Does it say because of he smoked strong tobacco? I bet you it does. You ate oysters and ice cream. Remember that. Yeah. But there's some great examples of that talk about his life. Okay. So and again, in this photograph out there, you can see where the AME church was, a colored church, and is that right? Okay. So here's our best view of the original AME church. It was on Long Lane that dated from the 1840s. In the 1863 photograph and later. Okay, so there it is, the colored church on that map, on a part of Long Lane that longer stands. I would say today that church stood near what is, I forget what they call it, but that Baptist, is it a Baptist church? It was a Baptist church. Now it's a Hispanic church. You know where I'm talking about. And then there's a group of houses at the cemetery, at what is now Lincoln Cemetery, and the lane that leads to the hospital you can see. Okay, in that view. Okay. And, something's wrong. I did something bad. Okay, I better use my thing. So there's 1, 2, and 3. And if I go to this, you can see on the 1850 map of the town, these 3 houses, Eden DeVan, Hillary Addison, Mrs. Sarah Armstrong. And you can see those 3 houses on the 1872 map. So, and of course, the houses along South Washington Street. And in this 1863 photograph from the top of Evergreen Cemetery, you can see the houses along South Washington Street. That's really our best view of those houses. And of course, this extraordinary photograph that came up on eBay about 4 years ago now, showing the stock house. But Andrew and I were like, wow, look, there's Eden DeVan's house on South Washington Street. And he also owned that house that we showed you near Lincoln Cemetery. And we've done a lot of research on the DeVans. And, some aspects of this story are very confusing and perhaps disturbing. But we have 3 sources for this. So I know Andrew doesn't like to throw this out lightly, but Eden DeVan seems to be, at least he's accused multiple times, of turning other members of the black community in, or as black members of the community are helping people escape through the area, he is assisting for money the slave catchers in their attempt to recover people. And we got just this letter in 1904 by one of the McAllisters, who ran the Underground Railroad stop, that just accuses him. Yeah. And, all I can tell you is looking at the historic records, because I can't find other people complaining, that there seems to be a division in the black community, and Abraham Bryan and Basil Biggs and John Hopkins go to one church in town and one congregation, and Eden DeVan is the leader of the other congregation. And he consistently votes people out or gets people kicked out of the congregation that appear to be people that are helping in the efforts of the Underground Railroad. So, circumstantial evidence is very good that it's true. Now, Eden DeVan had a couple, he's from Maryland, and he had a couple brothers that moved into the area. One was, or a brother and a sister. One was Nelson DeVan, and he died before the war, before the Civil War. But he had moved into Maryland, and they lived in Frederick County, Maryland, and he actually purchased his wife and children's freedom and brought them to Gettysburg. What happened to my thing? Oh, I didn't get to the next one. And his daughter, Martha DeVan, I believe, she's on display down in our museum. We have her photograph. We know people who were descendant from that family. She was born after they moved to Gettysburg. And their house stood at the corner of the Tawnytown Road and Steinway Avenue. She heard Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. Her house is right there. And two of her brothers joined the United States colored troops the day after Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. So, we have her in our Gettysburg Address section. Now, also, you might recognize this. She's also a face in our program that we have down there as you go into the Caught in the Crossfire. But we're just using her face in that program, and she's not the lady who gives the quotes. And then, of course, we have John Hopkins. John Hopkins owned a house on South Washington Street at the time of the battle, and he had purchased a house from Abraham Bryan. And he works at Gettysburg College and lives in a house there at the time of the battle. And it's been suggested that he is part of the local group that's assisting with the Underground Railroad. We don't have any actual proof of that, but it's hinted at in several accounts. And you probably know that we purchased the Jack Hopkins house, and that we're going to highlight the story of some of these citizens when we open that house. And when he died, I think in 1869, it was a big deal for the community in Gettysburg College. And you can see there that he was actually buried in York Street Cemetery.